early morning mist still lingered among the trees as Tu Diep stepped out of her small hut, a light coat draped over her shoulders and a simple woven basket in hand. Today she planned to visit the market to buy a few essential items for daily life. She walked slowly along the red dirt road, her steps steady but quiet. Since the day James left, he hadn't returned, and an indescribable feeling sat heavy in her chest. She didn't know if he was upset because she had turned down his feelings, or if he had simply moved on. Upon arriving at the market, her eyes suddenly paused at a small stall selling seedlings. Neatly arranged pots of green plants sat on a plastic tarp, mustard greens, fragrant herbs, even a few decorative plants. Tu Diep stepped closer, a faint light returning to her eyes. She knelt down beside the stall, looking at the soft, rich soil and the delicate roots reaching upward like tiny, hopeful lives. She smiled gently and asked, "Are these mustard greens?" The woman running the stall nodded. "Yes, you can plant them right in front of your house. You'll have fresh vegetables every day." They chatted for a while and the conversation drifted beyond gardening. They spoke about living alone, about holding on to small joys from simple things. Tu Diep nodded in agreement. In the end, she decided to buy a few seedlings to bring home. As soon as she returned, she washed her hands and began digging in the soil in front of her hut. She worked slowly, breaking up the dry dirt bit by bit. Her hands dug small holes, placing each young plant gently into the earth, then covering them with care and watering them lightly. While she worked, her mind wandered back to James. What was he doing now? Did he still think of her, or had he already forgotten? She didn't know if they would ever meet again. And even if they did, would he still want to be with someone like her? She sighed softly. Her hands, stained with soil, continued tending to the tiny garden she was building from scratch. She knew she couldn't sit still and wait for something to change. She had to stand on her own and build a life she could call her own. But deep inside, she still quietly hoped that one day James would return, and when he did, he would see the woman she was becoming. A woman who, despite everything, was trying her best to live a better life. While Tu Diep was tending to her freshly planted vegetables, somewhere else, Lynn stood at the front of the timber company office, a thick ledger in her hands, eyes focused as she double-checked each entry. Not long after, James's familiar car pulled into the yard. He stepped out, gave Lynn a nod and headed straight inside. Lynn followed behind, still holding the heavy book. The two of them sat down and began discussing work. James's voice was calm and steady, his expression composed, eyes pausing over the numbers with unwavering concentration. Once their meeting ended, James and Lynn made their way to the lumber workshop for a site inspection. They walked through the warehouse rows, occasionally stopping to speak with workers about the quality of the wood. While they were deep in discussion, Tu Diep arrived unexpectedly. She had come to find James. She stepped inside, but before she could call out, she saw Lynn standing beside him. A moment of hesitation crossed her face. Then she walked over and softly asked Lynn if she could speak to James. Lynn raised her eyebrows slightly, her gaze scanning Tu Diep from head to toe. After a brief silence, Lynn gave a subtle smile. Her tone was calm, but laced with something sharp. "The boss is busy. He doesn't want to see anyone right now." Tu Diep stood frozen for a moment, her eyes flickering with doubt. Then she nodded gently, whispered a thank you, and quietly turned to leave. She didn't know that James had seen everything from a distance. He didn't say a word, just stood there, silently watching her walk away, her figure slowly disappearing behind the row of buildings. On her way back, head down, she was suddenly stopped by a voice behind her. "Running away from me again?" Tu Diep turned sharply, frowning. "I have nothing to say to you." Powell stepped closer, his voice harsh. "You really think I'll let you go that easily?" He reached out and grabbed her wrist, trying to pull her back. But another hand intercepted him, gripping his arm firmly. James stepped in, his gaze cold as steel. "She's coming with me." Powell froze, clenched his jaw, then reluctantly let go and turned away, seething. Tu Diep stood there, still shaken. James looked at her, voice soft but steady. "Let's go." Back at the small hut, just as James stepped inside, Tu Diep suddenly spoke, her voice quiet but resolute. "James, I like you." James paused in his tracks, then turned to look at her. His eyes softened, deeper than ever before. He didn't say a word, he just smiled. And that one smile made her heart race like never before. The next morning, while the mist still clung to the treetops, Tu Diep had already risen early. She didn't go into the forest today. Instead, she wandered around the grapefruit garden behind the hut. The trees were heavy with fruit, golden, round grapefruits hanging low on the branches. The sight brought her a quiet, unfamiliar kind of joy. Standing beneath one of the trees, she reached up and picked the largest fruit she could find. After carefully peeling it, she bit into a segment and let the sweet, refreshing flavor spread across her tongue. She nodded to herself, pleased. This year's harvest was good. The fruit was not only abundant, but high in quality. Not wanting to waste the opportunity, she quickly gathered a basketful, tied it securely with bamboo string, and got ready to take them to the market. At the small village market, she sat in her usual corner, neatly arranging the ripe grapefruits for display. She posted a sign, 10,000 dong per fruit. It wasn't expensive, just right for the locals. People passing by noticed the fresh, juicy fruit and stopped to buy. Within an hour, her basket was nearly empty. As she counted the money in her hands, she felt a happiness she hadn't known in a long time. For the first time in ages, she felt the pride of earning from her own labor, of growing, harvesting, and selling something with her own hands. At noon, she returned to the hut and quickly got to work in the kitchen. She lit the fire and began washing rice, muttering softly to herself as she thought about what dish to make. She felt light. While she was picking vegetables, the door creaked open. James stepped inside. He had just come back from work, his shirt still bearing traces of road dust. Seeing Tu Diep busy near the stove, his eyes softened. "What are you concentrating on so hard?" Tu Diep looked up and smiled gently. "I'm cooking. I sold all the grapefruits today, so I want to treat you to lunch." James opened his mouth, ready to decline, but then his eyes stopped on a faint red scratch across the back of her hand. He walked over quickly, took her hand gently, his voice tense. "What happened?" Tu Diep pulled her hand back slightly and reassured him with a smile. "Probably just a thorn from the tree, it's nothing." Still unconvinced, James sat down, opened the bag he had brought, and took out antiseptic. He carefully applied it to her wound, movements gentle and steady. Tu Diep watched him closely. Something in her chest stirred. She no longer doubted him. The man in front of her wasn't just someone who showed up when she needed help. He was someone who stayed, who noticed the small things, who healed what others couldn't see. And in that quiet kitchen, filled with the scent of wood smoke and the warmth of sunlight, Tu Diep realized she was no longer alone. After a peaceful afternoon at the small hut, James and Tu Diep sat together outside, chatting in the quiet warmth of the sun. Light filtered through the trees, casting flickering shadows across the ground. The relaxed atmosphere brought a softer smile to Tu Diep's face, one that had become more natural in recent days. After a brief pause in conversation, James suddenly stood up. "I'm free today. Let me take you out to buy some new clothes," he said, his voice gentle, though his expression was sincere. Tu Diep looked slightly flustered and lowered her gaze. "I already have clothes. It's not necessary." James looked at her for a moment, then smiled. "It's not about necessity, it's because you deserve it." Unable to refuse any further, Tu Diep nodded, hesitantly. They got in the car and headed to a small shopping center near town. On the way, James received a call from Lynn, his longtime assistant. She mentioned something urgent about the construction project, so James decided to bring Tu Diep along. When they arrived, Lynn came out to greet them. Her eyes briefly flickered with surprise when she saw Tu Diep walking beside James. In the small meeting room, Lynn turned to ask directly, "Is this your girlfriend?" Tu Diep quickly lowered her head, her voice soft. "No, just a friend." James heard her response but said nothing. After the meeting, all three left the site together. James handed the car keys to Lynn, asking her to take the car for cleaning. Then he walked with Tu Diep to a nearby clothing store. Tu Diep picked out a few simple items, avoiding the more expensive ones. James waited outside, occasionally handing her a few more outfits to try on. After the shopping, they headed to a cozy cafe nearby to relax. The place was warm and welcoming, with decorations in soft shades of red. They sat in a quiet corner. James ordered drinks, then took out his phone and snapped a few casual photos, capturing the moment. Then he turned to Tu Diep, his voice calm but sincere. "I told you before that I like you, and today I still want to say it again." Tu Diep didn't respond right away. Instead, tears suddenly welled up in her eyes and spilled over before she could stop them. Startled, James moved closer and gently wrapped his arms around her. At that moment, Lynn returned. She froze when she saw them but said nothing. She simply walked over and sat down across from them. After a while, once James stepped outside to take a call, Lynn turned to Tu Diep. Her voice, no longer cold, was quiet and thoughtful. "James is a good man. If I were you, I wouldn't let someone like him slip away." Tu Diep sat in stunned silence. She never imagined that the person who had once made her feel so out of place would be the one to say the most meaningful words of the day. The afternoon sun stretched long shadows over the dirt path leading back to the small hut. James and Tu Diep had just returned from town after a long day of walking, shopping, and quiet conversation. As the car stopped in front of the hut, Haki, their loyal little dog, came running out, tail wagging excitedly, circling around them with joy. Tu Diep knelt down and stroked Haki's head, her heart swelling with a quiet, indescribable warmth. She never thought she would have such peaceful moments in her life. James watched her with a soft smile. Carrying the shopping bags, he followed her into the house. Tu Diep handed him a cool bottle of water, her voice gentle, like a quiet invitation. He accepted it and took a few sips before she slipped another, smaller bottle into his hand. "Bring this out back and water the garden for me, will you?" James blinked in surprise, then nodded, with a smile. While he stepped outside, Tu Diep headed into the kitchen, washing rice and beginning to prepare dinner. Her movements were smooth and focused, each gesture full of quiet care, as if she was slowly building a place she could finally call home. A little later, James came back in to help. He lit the fire, chopped vegetables, helped prepare the soup. They moved in sync, occasionally exchanging smiles and laughter over small, silly things. That evening, the kitchen was alive with warmth, the clinking of pots, the crackle of firewood, the sound of two people quietly finding comfort in one another's presence. As night fell, the meal was nearly ready. Tu Diep roasted a few ears of corn over glowing coals. When the kernels turned golden and fragrant, she handed one to James. He took a bite, nodded. "This is really good." Tu Diep laughed, her eyes sparkling under the glow of the oil lamp. But the moment didn't last long. James's phone rang. He listened for a few minutes, then sighed. "I have to go, something urgent came up at the company. I'm sorry I can't stay for dinner." There was a flicker of disappointment in Tu Diep's eyes, but she still smiled and nodded. "It's all right, go take care of it." Before leaving, James paused for a moment, then held up his hand with a small grin. "Can I take one of those corns with me? Consider it my dinner." She handed him one, and as their hands touched, even for a brief second, there was a warmth that lingered. James left, the hut falling into quiet again. But this time, Tu Diep didn't feel alone, because now she knew there would be more returns.
Nước đầy dần nảy mầm, lòng chợt dần lên cảm giác bình yên hiếm hoi. Nhưng sự bình yên ấy nhanh chóng bị xáo trộn khi cô nhìn thấy Giang, người đàn ông với nụ cười ấm áp đã làm trái tim cô rung động. Cô nhận ra mình yêu anh, không phải từ hôm qua mà từ rất lâu, có lẽ từ khoảnh khắc đứng trước cô, bảo vệ cô khỏi sự tàn nhẫn của bao những ngày, khi cảm giác ngọt ngào ấy len lỏi trong vào lòng. Nỗi tự ti lại trỗi dậy như một con sóng dữ. Mình là ai mà dám yêu anh ấy, một người phụ nữ nghèo khổ từng bị chồng bỏ rơi, không cha không mẹ, mình không xứng đáng. Cô tự nhủ, đôi mắt mờ đi vì những giọt nước mắt kìm nén. Diệp bước chân ra, đôi tay gầy guộc ôm lấy mình để xua đi cái lạnh của cơn gió sớm. Cô cúi xuống nhìn Haki, chú chó đang bẫy đuôi bên chân cô, và mỉm cười yếu ớt. "Haki, bạn đã đói chưa?" Cô hỏi với giọng dịu nhẹ nhàng như nói với một người bạn thân thiết. Cô